Michael Grayson, convicted of terrible crimes against children. For years, Michael Grayson was regarded as a model citizen in Ohio. As a youth counselor, he worked with troubled children, offering them guidance, support, and mentorship. He attended community meetings, volunteered at local shelters, and even received awards for his dedication to at-risk youth. To the outside world, he was an advocate for children's well-being. In reality, his reputation was a mask for his monstrous actions. Over the span of 2 decades, Grayson manipulated his position of trust, abusing countless minors under the guise of mentorship. He groomed his victims carefully, ensuring their silence through psychological control and intimidation. His carefully maintained deception unraveled in 2017 when authorities discovered a vast collection of incriminating evidence on his computer. The files contained thousands of messages, images, and videos that left no doubt as to his guilt. Arrested and convicted, Grayson was sentenced to 80 years in prison with no possibility of parole. At Kingsford Correctional Facility, Grayson was placed in the general population, a dangerous move for someone convicted of crimes against children. Within weeks, fellow inmates discovered the details of his offenses. Among them was Jason White, a career criminal with a history of violent offenses. White had spent most of his life behind bars, but one thing remained constant: his hatred for individuals like Grayson. 6 months into his sentence, Grayson was cornered in the shower block. White attacked with unrelenting fury, using a broken tile to stab him multiple times. By the time guards intervened, Grayson was already dead. White, when questioned, showed no remorse. "I did everyone a favor," he said. "No one's crying over him." Peter Langford, convicted of terrible crimes against children. Peter Langford built his career as an educator, rising through the ranks to become the principal of an elementary school in Nevada. He was known for his strict discipline, his sharp suits, and his ability to command a room with little effort. Beneath the professional image, however, Langford was a predator. Over the years, he carefully groomed his victims, using intimidation and his position of power to keep them silent. Whenever suspicions arose, he expertly deflected them, leveraging his authority to maintain his cover. His crimes came to light in 2019 when a former student, now an adult, provided overwhelming evidence of Langford's misconduct. Investigators uncovered patterns of abuse spanning decades, revealing a systematic effort to cover up his actions. Langford was arrested, charged, and sentenced to 55 years in prison, a punishment that ensured he would never again walk free. Despite the severity of his crimes, Langford was placed in protective custody at Redwood State Prison, where inmates with high-risk profiles were kept separate from the general population. His isolation, however, did not guarantee his safety. Marcus Greer, a notorious gang enforcer serving multiple life sentences for murder, learned of Langford's crimes through prison gossip. Greer, who had spent years behind bars enforcing his own version of justice, viewed Langford as the worst kind of offender. One night, Greer managed to break into Langford's cell. What followed was swift and brutal. Using a bedsheet, Greer strangled Langford to death, ensuring his final moments were filled with terror. When questioned, Greer showed no remorse. "Some people don't deserve to breathe," he told prison officials. Samuel Dorsey, convicted of terrible crimes against children. For over 3 decades, Samuel Dorsey was a revered figure in his Texas community. As a church deacon, he was seen as a pillar of faith, guiding families with his wisdom and leading prayer groups with an air of authority. Yet beneath his religious facade, Dorsey was a predator who used his position to manipulate and exploit young children entrusted to his care. His crimes remained hidden for years as he skillfully masked his actions behind scripture and influence. In 2020, his carefully crafted illusion came crashing down when a former victim, now an adult, came forward with concrete proof of his abuse. Investigators soon uncovered a history of violations stretching back decades, with more victims stepping forward to share their painful experiences. The congregation that had once praised him turned against him overnight, disavowing his name and demanding justice. Dorsey was arrested and held at Westbrook Detention Center while awaiting trial. At Westbrook, he was assigned a cell with Robert Vaughn, a convicted drug trafficker and career criminal serving a life sentence. Vaughn, a man who had spent most of his life behind bars, had little patience for men like Dorsey. He would listen in disgust as Dorsey attempted to justify his past, speaking without remorse and claiming that his victims had been misled into turning against him. One night, Vaughn decided he had heard enough. Using a sharpened toothbrush, he launched a frenzied attack, stabbing Dorsey multiple times in the neck and chest. By the time guards reached the scene, Dorsey had bled out on the cell floor. Vaughn, sitting calmly beside the body, reportedly told authorities, "If I had to do it again, I wouldn't hesitate." Raymond Cole, convicted of terrible crimes against children. Raymond Cole was known across the Midwest as Ray the Illusionist, a seemingly charismatic and talented magician who entertained children at birthday parties, school functions, and local fairs. Parents trusted him, teachers invited him into classrooms, and children adored his tricks. Behind the curtain, however, Cole harbored a monstrous secret. He used his performances as a means to gain access to vulnerable children, carefully selecting his victims from the crowds that gathered to watch him perform. His downfall came in 2016 when an anonymous tip led law enforcement to investigate his background. A raid on his suburban Illinois home uncovered a vast collection of incriminating evidence, including videotapes, photographs, and journals documenting years of systematic abuse. Cole's arrest sent shockwaves through the community as dozens of families realized they had unknowingly allowed a predator into their homes. His trial was swift and merciless. Faced with irrefutable evidence, he pleaded guilty and received a 60-year sentence, ensuring he would never walk free again. Prison, however, proved to be a far harsher punishment than his sentence alone. At Brickwood Maximum Security Facility, Cole was placed in a cell with Carlos Reyes, a hardened gang member serving multiple life sentences for violent offenses. Cole attempted to keep to himself, but his reputation preceded him. Within weeks, word spread among inmates about the nature of his crimes, and Cole became an immediate target. Reyes, a man who had long lived by a brutal code of street justice, saw him as an abomination undeserving of life. One morning, guards found Cole's lifeless body on the floor of his cell. His face was barely recognizable, his ribs shattered from repeated blows. A makeshift weapon, fashioned from a sharpened piece of metal, was embedded in his side. Reyes did not attempt to hide his involvement. When questioned, he simply shrugged and stated, "I did what had to be done." Nathan Wallace, convicted of terrible crimes against children. Nathan Wallace was once a decorated police officer in Florida, sworn to protect and serve his community. He wore his badge with pride, earning the respect of his colleagues and the people he was meant to safeguard. But beneath his uniform, Wallace was a predator, using his position of authority to exploit vulnerable children who trusted him. He hid behind his badge, covering up his crimes for years, manipulating evidence and silencing those who tried to speak out. His downfall came in 2021 when multiple victims finally broke their silence. A large-scale investigation uncovered a disturbing web of abuse with Wallace at its center. His arrest sent shockwaves through law enforcement, shattering the illusion of the once-admired officer. When brought to trial, the evidence was overwhelming, and Wallace showed no remorse. The court handed him a lengthy sentence, ensuring he would never see freedom again. Due to the high-profile nature of his case and his former position in law enforcement, Wallace was placed in a facility meant for high-risk offenders. Prison officials attempted to keep him in a controlled environment, but his reputation followed him inside. Among inmates, ex-cops were despised, and those convicted of crimes against children were marked for death. His time behind bars was short-lived. Despite the heightened security, Wallace was attacked within weeks of his arrival. Surveillance footage later revealed a coordinated assault in the exercise yard, where two masked inmates ambushed him. The attack was swift and brutal, leaving Wallace bleeding out before guards could respond. His murder sent a clear message through the prison walls. Not even former law enforcement officers were safe when convicted of such crimes. Edward Hawthorne, convicted of terrible crimes against children. For nearly 2 decades, Edward Hawthorne worked as a school bus driver, responsible for transporting young students to and from school every day. He was seen as a friendly, reliable figure in the community, greeting parents with a smile and remembering children's names. No one suspected that he had been using his role to gain access to his victims. preying on young passengers who trusted him. It wasn't until 2018 that his crimes were uncovered. Multiple students, now teenagers, came forward with horrifying allegations, describing a pattern of abuse that had been covered up for years. Parents were outraged, demanding answers as investigators dug deeper into Hawthorne's past. The evidence was overwhelming and he was swiftly convicted. The judge handed him a 45-year sentence without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Hawthorne was sent to Westwood Penitentiary, where he quickly realized the harsh reality of prison life. Child predators were considered the lowest of the low, and word about his crimes spread fast. Despite prison officials attempting to separate him from the general population, he was still a target. His fate was sealed one afternoon in the prison laundry room. Two inmates, both serving long sentences for violent offenses, cornered him when the guards weren't looking. What followed was a brutal and unrelenting attack. Witnesses later described how the assault was premeditated. Hawthorne had been marked from the moment he arrived. By the time guards intervened, he was barely clinging to life. He succumbed to his injuries shortly after being rushed to the infirmary. The attackers showed no remorse, later stating, "We did what had to be done." James Morton, convicted of terrible crimes against children. James Morton was not just a criminal. He was a powerful and wealthy businessman who had spent years orchestrating a sophisticated child trafficking network. Publicly, he was a well-respected philanthropist, a man who donated to charities and spoke at prestigious events. Behind closed doors, he operated a dark empire, facilitating the exploitation of countless children while ensuring that his own hands appeared clean. His downfall began in 2020 when an undercover operation exposed his network. His arrest sent shockwaves through the corporate and political world, as many influential figures had once been associated with him. His trial became one of the most publicized cases of the decade, with multiple survivors testifying against him in heartbreaking detail. His empire crumbled overnight, and the jury wasted no time in delivering their verdict: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Despite his wealth and past influence, Morton found no allies in prison. He was placed in solitary confinement for his own protection, but that did not guarantee his safety. In 2021, he was found dead in his cell under mysterious circumstances. The official report ruled his death a suicide, claiming he had hanged himself using bed sheets. However, rumors spread quickly among inmates and guards alike. Many believed his death was no accident. Some suspected that prison officials had looked the other way while someone orchestrated his demise. Others speculated that his former associates had silenced him before he could expose deeper secrets. Regardless of the truth, one fact remained clear: James Morton did not die peacefully. Victor Ramirez, convicted of terrible crimes against children. Victor Ramirez was once a highly respected youth soccer coach, known for shaping young athletes into disciplined players. He worked with elite training programs and was seen as a mentor to aspiring professionals. Parents trusted him, believing he genuinely cared about the development of their children. Behind the scenes, however, Ramirez was a predator who used his position to prey on vulnerable boys, exploiting their dreams of a soccer career to manipulate and control them. His crimes remained hidden for years, buried beneath his carefully curated public image. It wasn't until 2019 that a former player, now an adult, came forward with shocking revelations. His confession encouraged others to speak out, revealing a horrifying pattern of abuse spanning more than a decade. Ramirez was arrested and charged with multiple counts of misconduct, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. During his trial, victims testified in heartbreaking detail about how he had gained their trust only to shatter their innocence. The judge sentenced him to 50 years in prison, ensuring he would never have access to another child again. His arrival at Redwood Correctional Facility was met with hostility. Inmates despised those convicted of crimes against children, and Ramirez quickly became a marked man. He attempted to keep a low profile, but his reputation preceded him. His cellmate, an infamous gang leader known for his ruthlessness, saw an opportunity to make a statement. One night, the attack was swift and merciless. Ramirez was found in his cell, unresponsive, his body bearing signs of a violent struggle. Guards arrived too late to intervene. His cellmate did not attempt to hide his actions, later stating with a chilling lack of remorse, he got what he deserved. Franklin Dillard, convicted of terrible crimes against children. Franklin Dillard was supposed to be a protector. As a social worker, he was entrusted with the well-being of vulnerable children, those who had already suffered abuse, neglect, or abandonment. Instead of helping them, he preyed on them, using his position to exploit those who had nowhere else to turn. For years, he operated under the guise of a caring advocate. His colleagues never suspected him, and the children he victimized were often too scared or traumatized to speak out. But in 2022, everything unraveled. An anonymous tip led to an investigation, and the truth about Dillard's crimes finally came to light. Law enforcement uncovered disturbing evidence that confirmed years of abuse. His arrest shocked the community, and his conviction was swift. The judge handed down a severe sentence, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Dillard was placed in the general population at Ridgeway Prison, an institution notorious for its violent inmates. He tried to keep his head down, but his past was impossible to hide. In prison, crimes against children were considered the lowest of offenses, and it didn't take long for Dillard to become a target. One night, he was found lifeless in his cell. He had been strangled in his sleep, his body showing no signs of struggle. It was a silent execution carried out by an inmate who later confessed to the killing. When questioned, the attacker simply stated, "I was a victim once. People like him don't deserve to breathe." No one mourned Dillard's death. Among both inmates and guards, his murder was seen as inevitable. Justice carried out by the very people he had once deceived. Keith Baldwin, convicted of terrible crimes against children. Keith Baldwin had spent years running a daycare center, a place that should have been a sanctuary for children. To parents, he seemed like a warm and caring man, someone who genuinely loved working with kids. He went above and beyond to reassure families, gaining their trust while concealing his dark secret. Behind closed doors, Baldwin was a predator. For years, he systematically abused the children left in his care, using manipulation and threats to keep them silent. His crimes remained hidden for a long time, until 2017, when multiple victims, now older, came forward. Their testimonies were harrowing, exposing Baldwin's years of abuse. Investigators uncovered undeniable evidence, and his arrest sent shockwaves through the community. At his trial, Baldwin showed no remorse. The court, however, showed no mercy. He was sentenced to 65 years in prison, ensuring he would never walk free again. But once inside the prison walls, Baldwin quickly realized that he was a marked man. Child predators were despised in the prison hierarchy, and Baldwin's history of running a daycare made him one of the most hated individuals behind bars. Prison officials attempted to keep him away from the general population, but word of his crimes spread like wildfire. His end came swiftly. In the prison cafeteria, multiple inmates ambushed him in a carefully coordinated attack. They struck with brutal efficiency, ensuring he would not leave the room alive. Witnesses later described the assault as methodical. There was no shouting, no hesitation, only pure and unrelenting violence. By the time guards intervened, Baldwin was already unconscious, his body battered beyond recognition. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Among both inmates and guards, his death was seen not as a tragedy, but as an inevitability. Leonard Grayson, convicted of terrible crimes against children. Leonard Grayson's life was built on deception. To the outside world, he was a highly decorated military officer, a man who had served his country with distinction. He had received honors, led troops, and stood as a symbol of discipline and patriotism. But beneath the surface, he was a predator whose crimes against minors spanned decades. While stationed overseas, Grayson took advantage of his authority, preying on vulnerable children in war-torn regions. He used his power and influence to silence his victims, ensuring that those who dared to speak out were ignored or discredited. His crimes remained hidden for years, until 2019, when a joint investigation by military police and civilian law enforcement uncovered overwhelming evidence. Once hailed as a hero, Grayson was exposed as a monster. His trial was swift. Former victims testified against him, detailing the horrific abuse they had suffered. The court showed no mercy, sentencing him to life in prison without parole. Due to his military background and the severity of his crimes, he was placed in protective custody upon arrival at Ridgefield Correctional Facility. Prison officials believed that isolating him would keep him safe, but even in protective custody, Grayson was not beyond reach. In 2020, just a year into his sentence, another inmate managed to bypass multiple layers of security and gain access to his cell. The attack was swift and efficient. By the time guards arrived, Grayson was dead, his body showing clear signs of strangulation. The circumstances of his death raised many questions. Some believed it was an inside job, possibly orchestrated by someone in the military who wanted him silenced. Others suspected that a fellow inmate had acted alone, motivated by a deep hatred for men like him. Whatever the truth, one thing was clear: Leonard Grayson did not die a natural death. Martin Calloway, convicted of terrible crimes against children. For nearly 20 years, Martin Calloway was a beloved high school music teacher in Tennessee. He was well respected, known for his patience and passion for music. Parents trusted him with their children, believing he genuinely cared about their future. Administrators praised his dedication, and students saw him as a mentor who helped them grow into confident musicians. But behind the classroom doors, Calloway was a predator, using his influence to manipulate and abuse young students. His carefully maintained image shattered in 2018 when one of his former students, now an adult, came forward with a horrifying confession. Their testimony triggered a full-scale investigation, leading to the discovery of damning evidence: hidden emails, disturbing recordings, and handwritten notes detailing Calloway's methods for grooming his victims. The community that had once held him in high regard turned against him overnight. His trial was swift, and the jury showed no sympathy. The judge sentenced him to 75 years in prison, ensuring he would never set foot outside a prison cell again. Calloway was sent to Blackwell State Prison, where he quickly realized that his reputation preceded him. The hierarchy among inmates was clear. Child predators were the lowest of the low, despised even by murderers and gang members. Despite prison officials' efforts to keep him separated from the general population, word spread about his past, and he became a marked man. His fate was sealed one afternoon in the recreation yard. A group of inmates, having learned about his crimes, launched a brutal assault. Witnesses later described the attack as relentless. Calloway was punched, kicked, and beaten with makeshift weapons for nearly 15 minutes before guards intervened. By the time they reached him, the damage was irreparable. He was rushed to the infirmary, but his injuries were too severe. Hours later, he succumbed to his wounds. Among the prison population, his death was not mourned, it was celebrated. Ronald Bishop, convicted of terrible crimes against children. For over 3 decades, Ronald Bishop was a respected pastor in a small Kansas town. He stood at the pulpit every Sunday, delivering passionate sermons about faith, morality, and family values. He officiated weddings, counseled troubled couples, and guided young members of his congregation through difficult times. To the public, he was a man of unwavering integrity. Behind closed doors, however, he was a predator who used his position of religious authority to groom and exploit vulnerable children. For years, accusations against him were quietly buried by church officials who sought to protect the institution rather than the victims. Families who voiced concerns were pressured into silence, told that speaking out would bring shame upon the church. Bishop continued his deception, hiding behind scripture while committing unspeakable acts. His downfall came in 2021 when a whistleblower, a former church member, brought forward undeniable evidence. The case quickly gained attention, and a full investigation uncovered decades of systematic abuse. When confronted, Bishop denied everything, claiming he was the victim of a smear campaign. But the testimonies of his victims painted a different picture. A jury found him guilty on all counts, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison, stripping him of the power he had wielded for so long. Bishop was sent to Kingsford Correctional Facility, where he was placed in protective custody due to the nature of his crimes. However, even isolation could not shield him from the wrath of other inmates. One night, his cellmate, Carlos DeLuca, an ex-gang enforcer serving a life sentence, decided to take justice into his own hands. He waited until the guards had completed their rounds before using a bedsheet to strangle Bishop in his sleep. DeLuca later admitted to the murder without hesitation. "I was a victim once. Nobody saved me, so I did what needed to be done," he told investigators. Prison officials did little to punish him. To many, Bishop's death was not a tragedy, it was retribution. Walter Jennings, convicted of terrible crimes against children. Walter Jennings had once been a well-respected pediatrician in South Carolina. Parents entrusted him with the health of their children, believing he was a caring and dedicated doctor. His office was filled with bright-colored decorations, friendly staff, and a demeanor that made him seem like the kind of physician every parent wanted for their child. What they didn't know was that Jennings was systematically abusing his young patients. Behind the sterile walls of his clinic, he committed horrifying acts, betraying the trust of the very families he was meant to help. His crimes went unnoticed for years, until 2019, when a mother, suspicious of her child's unusual behavior, pressed for answers. Her persistence led to a criminal investigation, and soon dozens of victims came forward, each telling a story of abuse that spanned over 15 years. The trial was swift and damning. The evidence was irrefutable, and his victims, many now adults, testified with unwavering determination. Jennings was sentenced to 85 years in prison, a sentence that ensured he would die behind bars. Upon his arrival at Millstone Penitentiary, Jennings immediately became a target. In prison, child predators were the lowest-ranked inmates, often facing relentless violence from those who saw them as irredeemable. His reputation spread fast, and within weeks, his life came to an abrupt and violent end. During a routine lockdown, Brent Lawson, a convicted murderer with a history of violence, entered Jennings' cell. Armed with a makeshift knife, Lawson launched a brutal attack, stabbing Jennings multiple times before guards could intervene. The assault was so swift that by the time officers arrived, Jennings was already lifeless. When questioned, Lawson showed no remorse. That man deserved worse, he stated coldly. Prison officials later admitted that his death had been inevitable. No one, not even the guards, seemed surprised. For many, Jennings' death was not a tragedy. It was an unspoken verdict carried out by those who believed his sentence had not been harsh enough. Daniel Price, convicted of terrible crimes against children. Daniel Price spent years as a school bus driver in Illinois, a position that placed him in daily contact with children. Parents trusted him, believing their kids were safe under his supervision. However, Price used his access to isolate and assault his victims, targeting children who were too young or too afraid to speak up. His crimes remained undetected for years until 2020, when one brave student came forward with allegations. This prompted a full-scale investigation, uncovering years of abuse. When confronted with the evidence, Price broke down, offering a confession that left even seasoned investigators shaken. He was swiftly convicted and sentenced to 60 years in prison, ensuring that he would never see the outside world again. Upon arriving at Redwood State Prison, Price was initially placed in protective custody, a measure meant to keep him away from the general prison population. However, as overcrowding worsened, he was eventually transferred to a standard cell block. It didn't take long for inmates to learn about his crimes, and once they did, his fate was sealed. One evening, Price was attacked in the prison showers by 3 unidentified inmates. The assault was ruthless and prolonged. By the time guards discovered him, he had sustained fatal injuries, his body left crumpled on the cold tile floor. Authorities launched an investigation, but no one came forward to claim responsibility. Those questioned remained silent, and in the prison's unspoken code, it was clear that no one intended to speak. One anonymous inmate later stated, "Nobody cried over him, not a single soul." Henry Lawson, convicted of terrible crimes against children. To the public, Henry Lawson was a generous philanthropist, a man who had dedicated his life to helping children. He donated millions to charities, funded shelters, and established programs for at-risk youth. His face was frequently seen at fundraising galas, shaking hands with politicians and celebrities, all praising his efforts to make the world a better place. But beneath this carefully crafted persona, Lawson was orchestrating one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. For years, he ran an international child trafficking ring, exploiting minors for profit while using his charity work as a cover. He operated with impunity, bribing officials and silencing those who got too close to the truth. His network stretched across multiple countries, involving powerful figures who had a vested interest in keeping his operation hidden. His downfall came in 2017 when an extensive FBI sting operation exposed his crimes. The trial that followed was one of the most publicized in recent history. Victims, some now adults, took the stand, recounting the horrors they had endured. The evidence was overwhelming. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never walk free again. Despite his wealth and influence, Lawson found no protection behind bars. Brickwood Maximum Security Prison housed some of the most dangerous criminals in the country, and among them, Lawson was considered the lowest of the low. One morning, prison guards found him dead in his cell. His skull had been fractured from multiple blows, and forensic experts determined that the attack had been carried out with precision. Investigators suspected that it had been a coordinated effort by inmates who had learned about his crimes. No one was ever officially charged for his murder, and the prison remained silent on the details. For many, his death was not just an execution, it was justice served. Thomas Whitmore, convicted of terrible crimes against children. Thomas Whitmore was once regarded as a compassionate foster parent, known for taking in troubled children and providing them with a stable home. To outsiders, he appeared selfless, opening his doors to children in need and working closely with social services to ensure they were placed in a safe environment. But behind the closed doors of his Pennsylvania home, Whitmore was a predator. Over 2 decades, he systematically abused the children under his care, exploiting their vulnerability and ensuring their silence through threats and psychological manipulation. He was careful, selecting his victims from those who had no family to turn to and no one to believe them. For years, he maintained his charade, even receiving awards for his supposed contributions to child welfare. His crimes were finally exposed in 2018 when one of his former foster children, now an adult, came forward with undeniable proof. The resulting investigation uncovered a horrifying pattern of abuse spanning multiple victims across different foster placements. The courtroom was packed during his trial as survivors testified against him in heartbreaking detail. The judge showed no leniency, sentencing Whitmore to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Upon his arrival at Ridgeway Correctional Facility, Whitmore attempted to keep a low profile. He avoided eye contact, rarely spoke, and stayed inside his cell as much as possible. But the hierarchy within prison walls was clear. Child predators were despised. His end came swiftly. One morning, prison staff discovered his lifeless body in the laundry room, brutally beaten beyond recognition. The attack had been methodical, with injuries suggesting a prolonged assault. The perpetrator, an inmate serving time for armed robbery, later admitted to the murder. His justification was simple: "I found out what he did. That was enough." Marcus Dean, convicted of terrible crimes against children. For years, Marcus Dean was regarded as a pillar of his Florida community, a dedicated high school football coach who shaped young athletes into disciplined, high-achieving players. He was celebrated for securing college scholarships for his team members, helping them rise above difficult circumstances, and instilling values of hard work and perseverance. Parents admired him, administrators praised him, and students looked up to him. But beneath his carefully constructed image, Dean was a predator who exploited the very students who trusted him the most. His crimes remained hidden for years, concealed behind his status and the deep loyalty of the players he manipulated. He preyed on young athletes, using his authority to coerce and control them. Those who spoke up were dismissed, ignored, or even shamed into silence. It wasn't until 2021 that the truth came out, when multiple former players, some now adults, stepped forward with harrowing testimonies. Their courage sparked an investigation that uncovered undeniable evidence, leading to Dean's immediate arrest. At his trial, the court showed no leniency. The prosecution presented damning evidence, including written accounts, text messages, and witness testimonies that detailed his years of abuse. The judge sentenced him to 70 years in prison, ensuring he would never again have access to young athletes. He was sent to Kingsland Correctional Facility, a medium-security prison known for housing violent offenders. Dean lasted less than 6 months. Prison officials had attempted to keep him under surveillance, knowing that child predators were prime targets within the inmate hierarchy, but their efforts failed. During a routine cell inspection, guards found Dean unresponsive on the floor. His body was covered in bruises, his ribs shattered from repeated blows. Investigators determined that he had been beaten to death over the course of several attacks, likely by multiple inmates who saw him as an easy target. No one came forward to claim responsibility for the killing, and despite an internal investigation, no suspects were charged. Among inmates and even some staff, there was little interest in solving the case. His death was seen not as a mystery, but as an inevitability. Jeffrey Harrington, convicted of terrible crimes against children. Jeffrey Harrington was the definition of authority and prestige. As the principal of a well-regarded private school in Massachusetts, he had earned the trust of parents and faculty alike. He was known for his strict discipline, his polished demeanor, and his dedication to academic excellence. But behind his carefully maintained reputation, he was a predator who used his position to target young boys. For years, Harrington carefully selected his victims, choosing those who were vulnerable, isolated, or desperate for mentorship. He manipulated them under the guise of guidance, ensuring their silence through psychological coercion. He cultivated an image of being a respected educator, making it nearly impossible for his victims to be believed. It wasn't until 2019 that the facade crumbled when a former student, now an adult, came forward with recorded conversations that exposed Harrington's actions in explicit detail. The recordings provided irrefutable proof of his crimes, prompting law enforcement to act immediately. His arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Parents who had once entrusted their children to him felt betrayed, and former students who had once admired him were left horrified. His trial was swift, the evidence was overwhelming, and his lack of remorse only solidified the jury's decision. The judge sentenced him to 90 years without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would die behind bars. While awaiting transfer to federal prison, Harrington was held in a local detention center, where he shared space with inmates awaiting sentencing for various crimes. There, he encountered David Romero, a man serving time for drug offenses. Romero, upon learning of Harrington's past, grew increasingly hostile toward him. One evening, in what seemed to be a spontaneous act, Romero attacked Harrington in their shared holding area. Using a broken chair leg as a weapon, he bludgeoned Harrington to death, delivering repeated strikes to his head and upper body. By the time guards intervened, it was too late. Harrington lay lifeless, his skull fractured beyond repair. When questioned by authorities, Romero showed no remorse. His only statement to the guards was chillingly direct: "I did what had to be done." Richard Monroe, convicted of terrible crimes against children. Richard Monroe was not just another criminal. He was one of the most infamous child predators in the country, a serial offender whose crimes spanned multiple states. His arrest in 2016 marked the end of a years-long FBI investigation that uncovered a vast network of abuse, trafficking, and exploitation, all orchestrated by Monroe himself. His victims numbered in the dozens, and the extent of his crimes was so horrific that his trial became a nationwide spectacle. During the proceedings, Monroe sat expressionless as victims took the stand, one after another recounting the unimaginable horrors they had endured at his hands. The prosecution presented over 200 charges against him, ranging from abuse to trafficking to the production and distribution of illicit material. The sheer weight of the evidence left the jury no choice. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to multiple life terms, ensuring he would never leave prison alive. Due to the high-profile nature of his case and the sheer scale of his crimes, Monroe was placed in the highest security wing of Redwood Penitentiary, a facility reserved for the most dangerous and high-risk inmates. There, he was kept under constant surveillance, isolated from the general population for his own protection. Despite these precautions, his past caught up with him. One night, during a routine cell check, Monroe was found lifeless. His throat had been slit with such precision that forensic experts believed it was the work of someone with experience in handling weapons. Yet no murder weapon was recovered, and security footage from the time of the incident showed no signs of forced entry or struggle. The official report labeled his death as unresolved, but rumors spread quickly among inmates and staff alike. Some believed that Monroe had been killed by fellow prisoners who had managed to bypass security measures. Others suspected that corrupt prison staff had orchestrated his murder, seeing his continued existence as an insult to justice. There were even whispers that someone outside the prison, perhaps a victim's relative or an unknown figure with influence, had arranged for his demise. Regardless of the truth, one thing was certain: Richard Monroe did not die peacefully. These 20 men used positions of trust to exploit the vulnerable, hiding behind authority while committing horrific crimes. Though the legal system ensured their imprisonment, prison itself became their ultimate punishment. Marked as the lowest in the inmate hierarchy, they faced brutal retribution. Some were beaten, others executed, and a few died under mysterious circumstances. For them, there was no redemption behind bars, only the inescapable consequences of their past.